Okay, I will call the meeting to order. I'd like to begin by acknowledging we are in Treaty 1 territory in the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation. My name is Neil Harden. I'm chairing today's panel. With me is Carrie Linklater to my immediate left and Brent McIntyre to my far left. The assessor today is Marina Tenawara, and the recording secretary is Belen Rojo. We will be hearing applications for revision of assessment roll in accordance with the Municipal Assessment Act. The matters for which revision is requested have been described in each application, and we will limit discussion to those matters. The statements that the applicants or the assessor make at this hearing are sworn testimony, and anyone speaking to the matters must be sworn in. Be advised that comparisons of assessments of properties are not considered evidence of market value by the board. The board is appointed annually by council and is independent of it in the city administration. It makes its decisions on the basis of the evidence provided at the hearing and issues a written order that will be mailed to all parties as soon as possible. Please note that the board's decisions with respect to an application may be appealed to the Manitoba Municipal Board if the matter pertains to assessed value or classification, to the Court of Queen's Bench if the matter pertains to the application of exemptions from taxation. Should you wish to appeal, information on how to do so will be included with the board's order. With respect to the hearing process, I will confirm the matters to be addressed with each applicant following the swearing in. We will then have the assessor's testimony followed by questions the applicant may have, then the applicant's testimony followed by questions. Each side will have an opportunity to summarize if they wish. Once all the evidence about an application has been brought forward, the applicant may leave. The process will repeat for each item on the docket today. The session will close after all the applications have been heard, and the board will deliberate in private and make its decisions. You'll receive the order by registered mail as soon as possible. As information, all public hearings are recorded and will be part of the public record. So can you do the swearing in?
And you affirm the evidence I present is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I think. Please state your full name.
Rod Slaughter?
And you swear the evidence I present is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God?
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay, so the first item that remains on the docket today is 6650 Roblin Boulevard, and the matter is assessed value, so you can proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First, I will enter my recommendation.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Roll number 0100469200. Property address 6650 Roblin Boulevard. Property owner Park West Holding Limited. Property was originally assessed for $12,281,000. Today, I will make a recommendation to reduce value to $10,760,000.
How do you feel about that recommendation?
I thank Ms. Tenawara very much, but the client has provided direction that they'd like us to continue.
Okay, thank you.
So, this property originally built in 1976 and it has additions in 1996 and 2008. If I move to page number 2, you will see subject property leases, and leases vary from $11 to $25, but $25.50 paid for TD Canada Trust Bank. Leases fairly new and some old stuff. 1, 2. Page number 3 is my comparables. Those are in closer proximity, but similar type of units. The rents are vary from $11 to $26. Higher rents are mostly banks. Original assessment, we have two income streams. One is a bank, the other one is a neighborhood shopping center. Today, in my recommendation, I am proposing to have one income stream as a neighborhood shopping center. Then all the parameters apply as a neighborhood shopping center. Cap rate override to 7.5% based on the location. This location in very close to the perimeter highway in the Rockland Boulevard. The cap rate adjustment, small adjustment for the cap rate solely based on the location. Pictures attached in my addenda, page number 1. And I apologize, my page numbers are not that great. I can see. And one thing I forgot to mention earlier, there was an area discrepancy in this property. We made a correction for the area discrepancy. Now, total area of 61,224 is the corrected leasable area. The other reason for the recommendation, the correction to leasable area.
What was that number, 61?
224 is the correct number. When I moved to income expenses mailer, attached with my brief, they reported they collect rental income as 784,767, and also signage revenue and miscellaneous revenue, negligible number. But signage revenue we always include with the rental income because our per square feet rate calculating based on the board revenue. And they reported their expenses as $452,010. They recovered $411,569. They are non-recoverables if I only base on their expenses, but they reported to us 40,441. And when I move to my recommendation, we are giving non-recoverable amount of 17,069 plus 29,388, which is well within what they are non-recoverables. And net operating income reported is closer, not the exact same thing, it's closer. Their maintenance and repair cost is higher, 75,595 reported. So I assume the model driven appraised value of 10,760,000 will be the fair market value for this property for 2020. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, you have questions, Mr. Slama?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you very much for the proactive analysis and the recommendation. I think that's very good, but of course I have direction from the client to continue. So one of the differences, I guess, that we have that we'll be talking about in our presentation is that, and you just kind of alluded to it, there is only a deduction for non-recovered expenses of 2% in this analysis, correct?
Yes, that's right.
And if I understand correctly, in previous years, it historically has been 7% is the amount.
We classified as a shortfall, management, and other, we use three, it's all together. Generally speaking, all of the other parties told us it's 7%. We consider 5% management and 2% other and non-recovery, shortfall.
And then shortfall is the third item. Okay.
Yes.
So the difference between the past and now is that the shortfall remains, the 2% remains, the 5% has been.
5% management was removed for this cycle.
Okay. The cap rate evidence that you provided an analysis on your page 7 that showed what the city of Winnipeg had seen in their analysis of capitalization rates.
Yes.
And when we go down that column to retail, I guess this would be under neighborhood, you show, it's quite a wide range from the low 6s to the mid 9s. And then you make a mention that the majority are within the range of around 7.15 to 7.3.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And is that fairly consistent with last cycle? That seems to be pretty much the same conclusion as the last cycle, is that correct?
As I remember, yes.
Yeah, okay. And you have been very good in recognizing site-specific characteristics. You've increased the cap to slightly higher to 7.5, and you mentioned because of location. Okay, perfect. On page 4, I just want to confirm, sorry, page 5. So this was the original income stream, and I think you've made some adjustments to it, including bringing the bank that was separately, on a separate income stream. You've brought that now into the major.
Neighborhood shopping center, because we consider as neighborhood shopping center definition, it's everything includes.
Yeah.
Because previous cycles, we decided to sort it out.
Right.
Now we see as a, we do research and study all the time.
Yeah.
It is a one result this year. We try to include everything as either neighborhood shopping center, community shopping center, regional shopping center. It's everything included as a one income stream.
Okay, thank you. And just to confirm though, that the rents shown here, I guess both in the original and the revised, those would be model-driven rents rather than based on actual?
Yes.
Yeah.
Model-driven market rents.
Okay, I think that's all my questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, Brent, any questions?
Just one question, if you turn to page 5, and I add the bank back into the 58,390, I come up to 62,890 in Lease Square.
62,890, yes. Because I have to change the leasable area in retail. If I go to 8,607 square feet in my original, which is the yoga studio in the second floor. This is the number we have been using for the last 2 cycles.
Okay.
But this number based on the permit information they reported to us. But they continuously reporting different number in the rent roll. I checked with the Mr. Strater, and he provided a lease information page, but what's the correct leasable area for the yoga studio. Based on that number, I changed it to 7,430. That's the main difference. That's the main
difference.
Yeah.
Okay, no, that's fine, that's all my questions.
Okay, Karen, any questions?
Just one, did you have a chance to look through this property?
Not for the appeal, but I inspect this property for the licensing some businesses. Even yoga studio, I inspect the property for the BA purposes.
Okay.
I inspect this property, I think 2 years ago.
2 years ago?
Yeah, not
Okay.
for the, because I'm very familiar with the property. I did not go inspection and for this item.
Thank you.
Okay, I have no questions, so you can proceed then.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have some rebuttal, so maybe I'll pass that around and I can
Okay.
refer to that at the end of my presentation.
Sure.
So I'd like to start by saying that, again, I mentioned this before the questioning, but I want to commend Ms. Kinawara for her excellent work, proactive work. Out of the 8 properties that we have on the docket, she took the time to analyze each, and we managed to come to settlements on 5. I thought that was excellent. To be clear, in the settlements, neither of us are agreeing to any particular rates or allowances. We're coming to a final value, and that's it. The last three, there's slight differences, and I had direction to continue. And maybe I'll start by just kind of describing what one of the main differences is, and it has to do with something you've probably heard many times now, and that is the omission of the 5% portion of the non-recovered allowance. Another way to look at it is, from 7%, we don't think 2% correctly reflects what happens in the market, what we're directed to do by appraisal theory, or what we believe the assessment department may have originally intended. We have a report on non-recovered expenses, and we also have a second report on cap rate. I believe that everybody on this panel has heard the arguments around non-recovered, am I correct?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, so
Several
I'm gonna
times.
try and keep it short then, and maybe I'll just refer to certain things in the report, but to save time, I won't go through every single page. And so maybe what I'll do though, Mr. Chairman, is I'll start with the direct evidence, which is our valuation, and then we can kind of see where the differences lie, and then I'd like to talk about our evidence around those issues. So we have a direct evidence document that and again, Ms. Tenawara had explained the property very well, so I won't spend too much time on that. There was a bit of a discussion that we had around the second floor space. So this property has a second floor retail area that's accessed only by a staircase and an exterior balcony. And there was a slight difference in the area, and the city now recognizes that the area is actually only 200 square feet, I believe, rather than 9,000, I think, originally. Otherwise, there is a standalone bank as well on the site. And the buildings surrounding the site, including a Shell gas station and a Shoppers Drug Mart and a 7-Eleven, are all on separately assessed roll numbers. You can see on page 3 how the subject property actually sits. So I won't spend too much time otherwise on the description of the property, because I think we're very close in all parts of our analyses. Where we differ is, I'll start on page 8. What we've done is look at the actual income in place at the reference date. We consider what rents have stepped up, and we take into account that. We're trying to basically get to what a potential purchaser would be looking at April 18th if they were to examine the income potential for this property. There are 3 vacant units. The property has had, not a major vacancy issue, but it has had a concern. Up until 2015, the property was sitting at about 21% vacancy, and it's basically because they were having trouble leasing that second floor. Then in 2015, the yoga studio moved in, and that solved a lot of their problems. What they're left with, though, is there's 3 units which have been consistently vacant since that time. Units 2, 103, and 106. It results in approximately an 8% vacancy. That was what was applied last cycle. We don't see any reason, site-specifically or from the market, to veer from a slightly higher than market vacancy allowance for this property. And so difference number 1 is that the vacancy allowance we have is slightly higher than what the city's applying. Now, to be fair, in the city's recommendation, they blended in the bank. And I'll show you on the next page that we're keeping the bank as a separate income stream for no other reason than we just thought that was easier based on what the city did. But we have a very low vacancy on the bank. We're still allowing a 2%. So we're higher on the vacancy allowance on the strip mall, but we're actually lower on the bank portion. So the vacancy is being recognized based on a stabilized actual performance. Our rents are slightly different because I think the model has produced some rents that may be a little excessive to what is actually happening in the property. The average that we show here is $13 a square foot without the bank. And then we've applied a market rate on the vacant space of $17. So we have a slightly lower rent, so that's number 2. A slightly lower rent, slightly higher vacancy. We have no contention with the shortfall allowance that the city has done. And before I get to kind of, I guess, what would be the major difference, which is the non-recovered expense, I'd just like you to turn to page 10. because this is the valuation on the bank that, again, had been separated. But in this case, I agree with the assessor that, it's really one property, it should probably be under one income stream. Mind you, as an aside, I will mention that with retail, it's a discussion we'd like to have with the city assessor and the board. Because of the nature of the leases and retail properties, many tenants need to know how they fit within the larger picture. And the more that things are kind of jumbled together, the more difficult it is for people to know how their portion of the assessment works. Because many leases now on these properties allow for tenants to pay their taxes not on a proportionate share, but on their contribution to the assessment. So that's just an aside I wanted to mention, because it's a conversation I think that needs to happen in the near future. It doesn't really make a difference, it's just make it more transparent into who's being assessed how. In this case, though, the bank that we've pulled aside, I'd like to point out that our rent on the bank is considerably higher than what the city's using. The city had used a rent that was very close to the actual rent in place, of approximately $23 a square foot. But in fact, what happened, and what I need to be transparent about, is that there's a step up on that rent in late 2017. It stepped the rent up to $31 a square foot. I'm not aware of any inducements involved in that. There likely were. I'm not recognizing those either. I feel it is appropriate to use the actual stepped up rent for the same argument I have when I talk about other items, that this is what a potential purchaser would be considering as of April 18th. So a third difference is that we're higher, much higher on the bank, lower on the vacancy and higher on the rent. When all is said and done, one might step back and say, well, why on earth are we still talking about any of this? And the reason really comes down to the main difference, and that is with the non-recovered expense allowance. So I'll pause at this moment, and I'll just refer to this document that I won't go through page by page, because I think everybody has heard this before, but I'd like to hit on some very important points. What we believe has happened for the 2020 assessment is that the definition of this item in the parameters as being called management, a non-recovered expense allowance, has been taken at its face value. And in our opinion, what has been lost is A, the definition of what it really referred to originally. And again, this is our opinion. We don't mean to put any words into the city of Winnipeg's mouth, and we think they do an excellent job. But when we step back and look at this realistically, the hypothesis that this referred to a management fee does not quite make sense to us, because a management fee is something that is commonly known to be recovered. When it isn't recovered, in those odd cases like with a provincial or a federal tenant, that's an erosion to the net rent. It's a semi-gross rent, and it's an erosion to the face rent, I should say. We don't believe that this could have referred to management fees 100%. It may have had some consideration to that. But what this really should be referring to in our mind is what the market sees, what appraisal text has taught us, and what other jurisdictions have done, and also happens to be, and I'll show in a moment, what the definition actually was in the manual before the definition was omitted. That is that this refers to non-recovered management-related expenses to the operation of a property. This goes beyond management fees, above and beyond that. This includes many, many items, the largest of which often are leasing commissions and tenant inducements. And when we step back and look at what's happening in our market today, it's a very interesting time for this discussion to happen. Because, in our opinion, with office and retail especially, with what's happening in those two markets, on the retail side, because of the effect of e-trade, I'm not going to use terms like retail apocalypse that we hear all the time, but there is a fear of the sustainability of the income in bricks and mortar retail. And that's real. And what's happening is owners are having to spend more money to convert space and entice tenants. These are all the kind of costs that they can't recover from tenants. And these are exactly the kind of costs that the 5% allowance is supposed to recognize over the life of the property. So it's not an exact amount. We're not saying that you take, if it costs $1 million to get these new tenants in the building, that we deduct $1 million from the value. That's not at all appropriate, and it's not what's being suggested here. It also is exactly what the municipal boards have deliberated on in the past. You'll hear reference to 4 decisions from the municipal boards where they say, we will not deduct tenant inducements and leasing commissions. what they're referring to in those decisions is the request in each and every one of those cases by the owner to take out money already paid to gain a face rent and deduct that from the face rent. And we agree that's not appropriate. It's especially not appropriate because the board at the time would have been aware, from the evidence before them, which likely included the city's manuals, that there is an allowance which recognizes exactly that kind of expense. So there's a difference in opinion that's happening between the assessment department and ourselves about what those board decisions were actually saying. On one side, they're being taken to say, we don't consider tenant inducements or leasing commissions at all. And in fact, by eliminating those, we come up with a value that would be inflated from market value. And we say that does not make sense, because that would be in contravention to the Act, which states that market value should be, assessed value should be based on market value, with exceptions for things like railways or if there's equity involved or things like that. But not to ignore a very real expense item. If I could just take a moment, I'm just going to pull out a couple very quick references. From the appraisal text. I'll start by saying that in the 2002 and 1998 assessment manuals, the description of this item had been expanded from just being a non-recovered management expense to say that non-recoverable operating expenses were deducted from the effective net income to obtain the expected net income derived from the property. In current lease arrangements, almost all operating expenses are typically covered by the tenants, but for space, the property owner must, but for vacant space, the property owner must cover them. A fully occupied property will have very limited non-recovered operating expenses. The following typical non-recoverable expenses will be considered, and the number one is management, and it says reflects expenses that are incurred by the landlord that are non-recoverable from tenants, even with net leases. So when you have a net lease, management fee is recovered. They're being very specific. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about all the other things that you have to pay that you can't recover from the tenants that are real. I'll pause for a moment and talk about the 2%. So we had a 7% allowance in the past, and it's now been eroded to 2%, and we're finding that is because this management's been taken out. So what does the 2% cover? Because there's a hypothesis, well, that covers all these things. What the 2% was supposed to recover in our mind originally, and what makes sense from appraisal theory, is a structural reserve. So capital improvements that have to be invested in the property and never hit the operating statement, roof replacement, foundation concerns, things like that. They happen, people have to spend money on, they can't recover from the tenants. There's an allowance for that, and it's the 2% other, is what they call it. In our mind, we had done it, as part of the study, we looked at structural reserve alone, and we found that 2% was even likely on the low side. But of course, it's hard, when you're looking at a sample. We came up with 3% in this case. So we came to the conclusion that 2% cannot refer to anything else beyond structural reserve. What happens to the rest of these expenses that are real? Our study here that you've seen before goes through and shows that over the life of a property, you will have highs, you will have lows. You will have times when there's 0. You will have times when it's 15% of the effective gross income. But over the entire stabilized life of a property, typically it stabilizes out at around 5 to 7%. Now we're making sense again. The appraisal theory is very clear about these expenses, that they are real and they must be recognized. Leasing and capital costs, non-recovered expenses. The appraiser should also account for non-recoverable expenses, also called non-rechargeable expenses. The most important non-recoverable cost items to be aware of are space marketing costs, which include both tenant inducements and leasing costs, and an allowance for structural or mechanical repairs. That's the 2%. It's very clear. We know these are real in the market. I think the assessor has agreed these are real. We know that appraisal theory says that we must consider them. We seem to understand that the city's assessment manual in the past had defined this allowance to be exactly what we're talking about. And lastly, we know from the behavior of the two jurisdictions on either side of us, MPAC in Ontario and SAMA in Saskatchewan, that they also both allow a non-recovered expense allowance. This is from, on page 44 of our presentation, I'll just read the quote, from the MPAC in Ontario, Assessment Manual. The title, as in our manual, says non-recoverable expenses. Operating expenses that can be categorized as recoverable and non-recoverable expenses. They can be categorized as either. Recoverable expenses are those operating expenses that are recovered from the tenant as outlined within the lease and are typically recorded as recoverable income. Management fees, they're typically recovered. Under a triple net lease arrangement, the landlord includes the cost of most operating expenses in a lease. Therefore, expenses such as utilities, taxes, building insurance, and administration costs, including management fees, are recoverable. However, even with a triple net lease, there are expenses associated with operating buildings that are not necessarily passed through to the tenant, but rather absorbed by the owner. This is exactly what we're talking about. These expenses, referred to as non-recoverable expenses, may include items such as marketing costs. So you see a parallel now. We heard it from the appraisal text, we're hearing it from assessment jurisdictions. Large capital cost projects, that's the 2% structural reserve. Legal and auditing fees, professional fees are included in that, these are significant. And ongoing expenses associated with vacant areas of the building that continue to occur despite the occupancy status. That's the shortfall. So now we've hit, as Ms. Tenuera had said, the three items that are non-recoverable. Non-recovered management expenses, which have disappeared. Structural reserve and shortfall. There's been a lot of discussion around this. I don't want to go too long on this item, but we are adamant in our position that with properties such as this, especially with properties such as this, multi-tenanted retail, commercial, office properties, it is a mistake to ignore these very real expenses which are necessary to derive the very income that our assessment is based upon. So in short, we're applying a 7% non-recovered expense allowance, and even with the ups and downs between our opinions on the income, our value is lower because of that deduction. Lastly, we agree with the city that the capitalization rate of 7.5 is appropriate, and it should apply to the entire property, not exclude the bank. So we've also applied 7.5%, and we have no contention with that. So that completes it, Mr. Chairman. On page 11, you then have a summary of everything I mentioned, which is actual leases in place with stepped up rent, so we're being very transparent about that. A higher than market vacancy to reflect the actual site-specific experiences. An appropriate non-recovered expense allowance and a 7.5 capitalization rate. And that's what brings us to the lower value of $9,627,000. In the appendix is simply the assessment information that mirrors what the city has in evidence. The income expense mailer that was completed by the owner and the rent roll, and a leasing document for the property. And lastly, the board order from last cycle, which I know the board doesn't need to give any weight to, but just for your reference, where the value was reduced to $9,032,000 with a 7.5 capitalization rate, and the applicant's NOI, which of course included everybody. There was no dispute at the time that 7% should be the non-recovered expense allowance. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Okay, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Two things. I have questions related to the presentation solely based on the property, and I have a rebuttal based on the non-recoverables. Can I do both same?
Yes, do both at the same time.
Thank
Hand
you,
out
Mr.
the
Chairman.
model now, please.
I think everyone might see this package before. rebuttal package. I have question. Do Mr. Slaughter aware we are mainly focused on the municipal board orders and case law related to the assessment?
Yeah, my understanding is that the city's position is twofold. One, that the definition of management may be different than what we believe. And secondly, to back up that position, there are the 4 board orders that you refer to, which deal with part of that non-recovered expense allowance that you described.
Yes. Yeah, if I move to page number 26. Page number 26 on, sorry, my non-recoverable page. Second paragraph, the board reiterate the tenant improvements, leasing commissions, and the leasing intensives are not expenses which may be used to reduce the income for the purpose of calculating market value. In here, if I focus on this one, in paragraph explain, and what you explained to so far as the using to reduce the gross income, is it different or the same?
No, it's different, because the context of these decisions is referring to a very different question, which I alluded to in my presentation. And the question was to make a deduction from the net rental income for the expenses already incurred to derive that income.
Okay, thank you. And if I move to page number 26, and tenant inducements, number 4, the paragraph, and also clearly mention about the tenant inducements and those non-recoverables. And is
That
it the
page?
same thing? Page number 34.
34,
item
oh, you said
number-
26.
Yeah.
Sorry, it's my mistake. Sorry,
I
34.
was wondering what
Sorry, it's my mistake.
paragraph you were.
Okay, page number 34, item number 4, tenant inducement. Yeah, then it's also explained how we use for the tenant inducements and why we not use the non-recoverables. You seen these ones before?
Oh, yeah, we've gone through. And if I may, Ms. Tenawara, maybe I'll just try and, because we've gone through these decisions
Yeah.
very carefully.
Yeah,
And I'll just describe the kind of path that the municipal boards have been thinking on this item. They refer in this decision to the decision which becomes their guidance, and that was A97065. It has to do with the National Trust Building. It's a 1997 assessment for an office tower, 444 St. Mary, I think is the property. In that original decision, as well as the Richardson Building in 1994, both had this item before the board for the first time. And in both cases, what was being asked by the owner's agent is that inducements to entice tenants with a high vacancy recaptured in the 1986 sales price. Mr. Simmons' contention is that the costs of these tenant inducements should be applied in reduction of the base rents of the leases. So what they're saying is, we had a vacancy issue. We've now got great rents in place, let's say arguably they're $15 a square foot. But it cost us millions of dollars in inducements to attain that $15. So what we'd like you to do is take the amount that it costs us to get the $15 over the life of the lease, over the 10 years, and let's say it works out to $5 a square foot on average, and deduct that from the $15. That request, A, is very different than what we're talking about. It's not dealing with the concept of these items, it's asking for a massive deduction for something that's already been spent. So number one, these sentences are being taken out of context from decisions which were asking something completely different than we are today. And number two is, in the decision 97065, which all of these decisions refer to, and in most decisions subsequent, The city's position, again, I read you what was in the assessment manuals at the time, that the 5% allowance referred to non-recovered expenses. And if you back up and say, what are non-recovered expenses? They're these items. So is it not plausible that the boards in these cases, when they're being asked to make this large deduction from the face rents, we're also kind of saying, wait a minute, we have an allowance for those items. It's the 5%. I think that's a much more plausible explanation than what the city's implying, which is that they're making a jurisdictional exception. And that's a very large term from an appraising standpoint. That means that market value does not equal assessed value because we're making some difference, which is fine. It happens in assessment. It happens when the legislation directs you to do something like use regulated rates on railways. That's real. But taking an out of quote or out of context comment from a municipal board decision and saying that that produces a jurisdictional exception, which would inflate values and create something that was in contradiction to the legislated act, isn't appropriate. So I think we have to be very careful with these quotes and understand what was being discussed in those decisions and what they're referring to when they make that comment. It's completely in contradiction to market behavior and appraisal theory to ignore these items. But I agree with them. It's not appropriate to deduct them from the face rent in lump sum value. I hope that answers our thoughts on this matter.
Yeah. Then if I move to different question, in city manual, we always label as the non-recoverable as the three categories, shortfall and management and other. Is there, the other is definition you mentioned is the structural reserve, but in our manual, does it mention as a structural reserve?
It certainly says as part of it. It says that there are other items as well, hence the name
We
other.
clearly tell is the other,
Yeah.
other expenses. Then management cost, we very vaguely label as a management cost and other expenses.
Yeah.
But it's the structural reserve is what you think. Is that correct?
Well, that's true. I mean, it has been labeled as structural reserve, and then there are other items as well. But
Okay.
our position is that in our study, we've looked at both sides of this equation.
Okay.
And we're saying that 7% was allowed in the past, and it seems to hold water with what we find. But we see no evidence to take that and now shrink it to 2 when we look at all of the items it's supposed to include.
Okay, thank you. This question particularly based on the property we discussed. You apply very close to the actual rents,
Yes.
and even the bank income stream, you apply step-up rents. Why you don't apply non-recoverables as they reported?
As reported, because with an allowance, you shouldn't ever just use the 1-year statement. That's the point of an allowance. You have to look over the life of a property. There are cases where allowances should be probably examined. Perhaps they're too high in certain circumstances for certain properties. Perhaps they're too low. That hasn't really been done because people are saying that, look, it's over the life of the entire property. So, and I mentioned before that there are years when you'll have 0, and there will be years when they're quite high. But it's a stabilized allowance.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all my questions.
Okay, Brent, any questions?
I have one question. Now, you mentioned the 2 jurisdictions on either side of the province. What does the province do for non-recoverable?
They still allow it. We're dealing with it right now, and there's still the 5% and 2%.
That was it?
Okay, Karen, questions?
I have none, thank you.
And I have no questions. So is there any summation that the parties wish to do on this?
No, thank you.
Oh, that's fine.
Okay, and we will consider the non-recoverable evidence become we go through.
Yes, yeah, thank you.
Is the rebuttal or the non-recoverable for all the files as well?
Yeah, actually,
Yes.
yeah, but I didn't have to present it in this case because we agreed in the end on the cap rate. So
For
Well,
I just
you had
need to
cap
know-
rate rebuttal too, so
Yes.
didn't really refer to it.
yeah, because we ended up agreeing to the cap rate, so I thought, I'll leave it for the next one if we need to.
Okay, no, sorry.
The
I just-
non-recoverable? Yes,
It
it's
is?
for everything.
Okay,
Yeah.
I'll just give you more copies.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you.
Never mind. Okay, thank you for that. We will go to 1853 grants.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Poll number 120975291100. Property address 1853 Grant Avenue. Property owner Keneston Grant Holdings Limited. This property was built in 1979 to 2004 range. And if I move to page number 3, those are my comparables. Comparables in the Keneston area and the Run, and the similar type of businesses and similar type of leaseable area. It's a range of rents. Property was valued as a neighborhood shopping center, one income stream from the beginning. And our overall blended rent, $22.09 per square feet. You can see the picture of the property in my agenda to get the understanding. This is the picture page of 1, the location. It's corner of the Grant and Keneston, facing Grant. All the 3 pages show the pictures. We apply all the model-driven parameters to assess this property. And if we move to income expenses meter, attached with my brief. I'm moving to page number 1 of income statement. This property did not report extra vacancy on this period of time. And also, it was reported non-recoverables in page number 3. And with the leasing commission, I remove the leasing commission to calculate what actually they are non-recoverable expenses, and give them a 4% market vacancy to calculate what their actual non-recoverable amount. My calculation using what they reported came as 2.3 non-recoverables in this property, using solely in what they reported. We are giving 4% of non-recoverables, including shortfall vacancy amount and the 2% other non-recoverables. Cap rate is 7.15. I'm asking to board to confirm the value as it is. If I speak little bit as a comparison, me and Mr. Slaughter, we are differences in 5% management only. Everything we are in the same page, but 5% management, solely based on what they actually have reported to us, which is 2.3%, and we are giving 4%. I'm thinking it is fair. Then current market value of 2020 market value of 17,612 is fair market value for this property. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, questions?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, no questions. Thank you.
Is Carrie, any questions of the assessor?
Sorry, you probably said this in your presentation, but your vacancy loss is 4% on this property?
It is the model-driven vacancy.
Okay.
We are giving, no matter what, we are giving 4% vacancy for the neighborhood shopping center as the market vacancy.
Thank you.
Brent, questions?
And just to add to that, so it's fully occupied.
fully occupied at
Thanks.
that period.
Thank you.
Okay, so you can begin your presentation, Mr. Slaughter.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So the property, as described, is at Grant Keniston. It doesn't include the office at the end, it's just the retail section. There's a map, overview map on page 3. I don't think we need to talk any more about the property description, so I'll just get right down to the page 7, which is where we start our analysis. Just to point out that actually the property did have some vacancy issues at the reference date. There's 2 units, 1873 and 1881, that were vacant at that moment. Generally, this is a strong performing property, though. It's well managed and it does well. At that time, the vacancy was 6%, but that's not a stabilized. Typically, there's usually 1 unit vacant at any given time, therefore we have no contention with the market vacancy allowance. When we start to see patterns going above that, that's when we feel we need to address. But, so just to answer that question, there was some vacancy, but not enough to warrant a difference in vacancy allowance. This is similar to the last case, Mr. Chairman, where we've done an analysis of all of the rents in place, recognized step-ups, been as transparent as possible, and we actually have a higher potential income than the city has based on their model-driven rents. And again, one might say, well, then why are we here? And the difference is, or the reason is, that on the expense side, there are 2 things which actually result in a lower NOI, from our opinion. Number 1 is on the shortfall rate. The city's model applies $8 a square foot, but actually this property has a higher expense experience than that. Their recoverable expenses are close to $11 a square foot. And for that reason, we're asking the board to consider a slightly higher shortfall allowance of $10. It's a minor difference, but that's difference number 1. And again, when we look at our higher rents, we're still probably looking at either an equal or maybe even higher NOI. But the second difference is what puts us at a lower position, and that is, again, we cannot ignore the fact that these type of properties incur non-recovered expenses beyond structural reserves, beyond roof replacements and such. In any given year, you might see that allowance to be a little lower, you might see it to be 4%, you might see it to be higher. But that's the point of a stabilized allowance. They are real. Anytime the property has to bring in a new tenant, we incur these kind of expenses. We submit again that the municipal board's comments on this matter were answering a very different question. They weren't contemplating whether very real expenses should be excluded in valuation, which would clearly indicate an inflated value and something in contradiction to the legislated act requirement of determining market value. But I'll save time by not going through the whole argument again. I'm just going to say that these are real, the property experiences them, any owner would recognize that, especially in a case like this. They'd be looking at it almost like a very strong performing property with good rents, and they'd say, well, what's next? As these expire, what happens? You incur these expenses in order to drive that income again. Nobody would say that they could get that kind of income over the life, the holding period of the property, without incurring the expenses necessary to drive it. So we feel it is short-sighted to completely omit that expense. And so on page 9, we have our inflated actual income with market vacancy allowance, slightly higher shortfall allowance, 7% rather than 2% for the total non-recovered allowance. And we agree in this case with the city on the capitalization rate of 7.15%. Our resulting value is $16,929,000. I'll just mention that the assessment last cycle, based on very similar performance, was $15,154,000. So I think the city's 2020 assessment, which was 16% over that, was getting excessive, but I'm not putting too much weight on the last cycle. I just wanted to point that out. So that's all, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Any questions of Mr. Slaughter?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. Sorry to ask the same question again.
Yeah.
This property also not reported that much of non-recoverable expenses. They are recovering almost everything they pay. Then why we are not focusing what they actually?
Yeah, well, first, they don't recover everything. They have very clear non-recoverable
close.
expense items.
Yeah.
Yeah, and there are items here which they could never recover from their tenants. But again, the point of the allowance is that you'll have properties like this that are doing quite well at the time of the reference date, and we assess them accordingly. We assess them quite strongly because of their performance. But the allowance is supposed to recognize that over the life of the property, these expenses are necessary to derive this income. So it's completely inappropriate, in our opinion, to assess them based on their strong performance, but ignore the fact that money is required to drive that. And that's the appraisal theory, that's the market behavior, it's the practice of assessment jurisdictions around us, to recognize that over the life of the property, these expenses must be recognized.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Carrie, any questions?
I have no questions, thank you.
Brent?
No questions.
Okay, no questions. So we will come to the last property on today's agenda. 2235 Camden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will enter my recommendation.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Roll number 0306 2951500. Property address 2235 Pemina Highway. Property owner Markham Center Limited. Property was originally valued at, for 2020, $8,383,000. Today, I'm proposing to reduce value to $7,914,000.
And how do you feel about that recommendation?
I've talked to the owner and he's directed me to continue, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. I presume so, but had to ask.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Page number 2 has subject property leases in page number 2 and 3. It's listed. The lease rent range, it is, if I see, $13 to $20 range. This property we value as a three income stream because the gas kiosks, gas pumps, we always like to keep it separate because of the additional building value only effect for the gas station. Because all the underground tanks and shelters and everything we include as additional building value. We always keep the gas station separately. And neighbor shopping center and the medical office building, OFM, because this property, if you see the pictures from this property, attached to my agenda, you can see clearly 2-story medical office building. As I told, it's a medical office building. It's mostly chiropractors, doctors, dentists, and all of labs there. The other one is the neighbor shopping center. It is a 1-story neighbor shopping center. So we keep the three income stream as it is for the recommendation. But I will explain why my recommendation is different than original value. We use the predominant income stream cap rate applied for the three income stream, which is 7.55. Originally, we have three different cap rates, 6.15, 7.55, and 7.3. Now we are using predominant cap rate of 7.55 for entire three buildings, income streams. If I speak separately in my recommendation, neighbor shopping center per square foot rate overall blended $16.16 in my recommendation. Medical office is $15.39 and gas kiosk as it is. Me and Mr. slaughter is very close in our rents. 1660, if I do the comparison, 1660 neighborhood shopping center, I'm using 1660 cents per square feet. Mr. Slaughter is asking 1637 cents. The medical office building, I'm using 1539 as overall blended and asking $16.62 as the overall blended. Those are overall blended, just a conclusion, where we difference in value. And I checked the income expenses mailer, what they reported, and how they recovered their expenses. They also recovered expenses here, but slightly higher than the other properties, lower than the other properties. And they reported maintenance and repair as a $164,657. I'm not 100% sure this might include capital cost improvements as a bigger roof renovations such as. So it is difficult to make a conclusion here, what is their non-recoverable expenses amount because of the way they reported. But I believe our given shortfall allowance of $8 per square feet, shortfall allowance and the 2% within the range of non-recoverables. So I'm asking to reduce the value of this property for $7,940,000. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Questions, Mr. Swan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ms. Tenor, did you have a chance to inspect this property?
I did not inspect this property as per this appeal, but this property, I'm very familiar. I inspect many times, I go many times. It's a very familiar property. It's my neighborhood, in my neighborhood.
Would you agree with me that the property is in need of a fair amount of improvement, especially with the parking lot and the surrounding sidewalks, the concrete?
I need to agree to that.
Yeah, okay. I asked earlier in the hearing about the capitalization rates that the city were applying and your internal study, and the conclusions of which appeared to indicate that there hasn't really been any compression between the last assessment cycle and the current, that the cap rates are fairly stable between them. That's correct. And you agree with me that this property had a higher than usual capitalization rate last cycle by the city of Winnipeg of 7.75%.
Yes.
And do you think it's appropriate that in light of a market that doesn't seem to be showing compression, in light of what appears to be a need for attention, that the cap rate should have compressed in that period?
Honestly, it's really a difficult question to me to answer. Because model-driven cap rate, we get the 3 different cap rates. The neighborhood shopping center, the model-driven, using the model data we entered, it should be 7.15. But basically, seeing this overall property and the way it's located and all the other problems they have, and the medical office building has a second floor tenant.
Yes.
And all of those ones, that's the main reason, as even though we cannot combine these 3 as a one neighborhood shopping center, we need to keep it based on some principles, we need to keep it separate. The only fair thing I could do, use the predominant cap rate, which is 7.55. I don't think we should use the last year cap rate, but I cannot certainly answer your questions why.
Yeah, no, that's fair, and I think we're on the same page, if I understand correctly, that there are site-specific factors about this property that warrant higher than model capitalization rate. Just to what extent, I guess, is where we disagree. But, and that's, if I understand correctly, that's why you've adjusted it to the 7.55%.
Yes, because I thought about the predominant income stream is the office medical.
Yeah.
Then it should be fair to use this one. And also, I did some correction in the additional building value. It is different than the original. It is just a correction.
Oh, okay, I see. Okay. That's all the questions, thank you.
Okay, Terry, any questions of the assessor?
I have no questions, thank you.
Brent?
I have no questions.
Okay, so we shall proceed with your presentation.
Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you very much to Ms. Tenuera for looking into the site-specific factors of the property. There's still some differences that we have, which I'd like to quickly hit upon. There are things about this property that, after inspection and discussion with the owner, why we can't accept the city's revised value and need to continue. It does need a lot of attention. It's had a lot of repairs, repair and maintenance over the last number of years, and as a result of that, their performance is doing well. So we're assessing a property based on strong performance. And we're not far off. And again, I'll show you that we're actually a little higher on the income because we're using the actual income. But when we use the actual income, we have to recognize that there are costs that need to be recognized to drive that income. And there are risks to the sustainability of that income when we look on an income approach about how it will perform in the future. On page 8, we have it as the different income streams, but we agree this is one economic unit. We're almost bang on with the city as far as the retail portion, the neighborhood shopping center. The rents, the actual rents in place, including step-ups, come to a very, very close number. We have no contention with our vacancy allowance on this portion. We do, however, recognize that this property has a higher repair and maintenance and overall expenses than what we've seen with other properties. And when we take a look at the last number of years, the income statements show that the recoverable expenses are higher than what would equate to $8 a square foot for shortfall. And in these cases, we try and recognize what's actually happening in the property. In 2017, the actual expenses are just under $15 a square foot. And so we've used $13 as our shortfall. So that's a small difference, but difference number one is that our shortfall is reflecting more of the actual expenses, just like our rental income is reflecting the actual income. Number two, again, a property like this has non-recovered expenses. They're real, they should be recognized, they're recognized by the market, recognized by appraisal theory. We do not think that a sudden compression of that allowance from 7% to 2%, including structural reserve when it occurs, is in any way sufficient. And we ask for 7% to be reinstated. We've added a bit additional income here for billboard income. Before I talk about capitalization rate, Mr. Chairman, I'll just go through the other two income streams. So we have the office portion, the multi-story office. Our rents are actually higher than what the city is showing. And we've applied that actual income, and we agree to the market vacancy allowance, and we agree to the expenses on this portion of the property. But again, we ask that the non-recovered expenses be applied. And again, before we talk about the capitalization rate, I'll just skip to the last portion, which is it's a kiosk, gas kiosk, a Domo that's on the site. I think the city and we are basically in agreement about the income. Yeah, we're exactly the same in the analysis of the income, which is based on the actual performance of the property, but where we disagree, well, I think, Ms. Tenuera, you must have made an adjustment to the, sorry, I'll just pause 1 moment. Yeah, the city has added an additional value. So just to back up, the gas kiosk is assessed basically as a pad lease and then a value for just the small kiosk, a 66-foot kiosk. But then on top of that, they add a value for the additional improvements. It's based on the cost approach. And that's $133,000. But sorry, here it's $155,000.
Mine's original was 181,000.
That's what I thought, okay.
Yeah,
And now-
181,000. Then I went through the detailed structure and I found the error. It was corrected.
Oh,
It was
okay.
reduced to 155,000.
I see, so sorry, that's why I was pausing there, I couldn't understand why this looked different now. Our contention was that there is no way that these kind of assets, which are depreciating assets, they're underground tanks, a small canopy, and fuel dispensers, which actually by appraisal theory are supposed to be considered chattels. We don't see any reason why those would appreciate by 36% in 2 years. And we ask that something closer to 131,000 be used. I would accept 155,000. So we're good on the gas bar. So the only item left then after these slight adjustments, basically around the expenses, is on the capitalization rate. If I may now turn to this very lengthy document, but I'm going to go very quickly. This is our retail capitalization rate study. And to be fair, we're actually thinking the city has done a very good job on cap rates. We don't have much disagreement. This study goes through our analysis of some comparable properties, and they're done in the same manner that we assess properties for valuation, which means we're including 7% non-recovery expenses. We're doing it apples to apples in our valuation methodology, and it's very transparent. Our conclusions are actually bang on with what the city's conclusions were, where you have some properties that are very low, are hovering around in the low 6s, and you get up to, I think the city mentioned 9.3. We have the same data. We share the same opinion. And when you look at all the characteristics of those, I'm not going to go through each one. The low cap rates usually have a reason. There could either be a very strong covenant, or a very common thing in the market now is there's a lot of upside. So it's a good performing asset, but for whatever reason, it's not really capturing its true income potential. And very bright investors will come along and they'll say, I'll buy that because I know I can turn that income around to something 50% higher. So the cap rate appears low. Sale price per foot doesn't, but the cap rate looks low, and you kind of go, well, why is that? And the fact is because they're buying an upside. It's one of the fundamental parts of the capitalization rate, is what sort of appreciation can you get out of this asset. When you're looking, though, at a standard property that's probably performing where it should, you shouldn't use these optimistic cap rates and say, we can get that sort of return. And that's why you have such a range. You really got to look at the difference, or the reasons of what's happening in each cap rate. And in the end, the city and Altus have come to basically the same conclusion. Big range, a lot of reasons for the range. Here's where the medians and the average sit. It's basically in the low 7s. Everything's fine. So far today we haven't had to talk about cap rate. But site-specific characteristics have to be recognized as well, not just in the performance of the income, but in the property itself. And in talking to the owner, to be honest, I wasn't bright enough to figure this out myself, but in talking to the owner, there are concerns in the risk potential. So yes, you can do a lot of work, you put in a lot of money, you get some good rents, everything looks great. But if I buy that property, and I knew what he knows, the sustainability, which is the second big component of cap rate, the sustainability of that income is a little more risky than typical because of that office building. In other words, and it makes sense, to keep the sort of occupancy he has in the office building is, it comes with a greater risk than a standard, plan area strip mall. And it's interesting, because when we look at the comparisons that I just mentioned, that we look at on page 12 of this study, and I'm not going to go through this whole study, but it's got a lot of information about 3 things. One is, what's happening out there with cap rates? Why is it happening? 2, what is behind the scenes that's driving some of the fundamentals of real estate? And that is the e-commerce effect.
I think you have 2 page 12s.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The page after it is also a 12.
Okay, this would be the,
Pictures.
so this is in the retail capitalization rate study.
Oh, you go 12, 13, and back to 12.
Oh, I apologize. Yeah, so it's the first part.
First 12, okay.
First 12. So this is, as I mentioned, this is the summary that we have, which is almost bang on with what the city reports from their internal study. And the median is almost bang on with what the market brokers are stating, and that's why cap rate on the retail side isn't a big conversation. But here we have a property that, as I mentioned, is a little different. It's got this office component. The very first comparison on this page is the best comparison to the subject property. The address of that property is 2211 McPhillips, and it's almost identical, and there's a picture on the second page 12. And it's very similar. It's similar vintage. It has a plan area strip mall with a 2-story office component in the middle, and instead of a gas kiosk, it's about the same size of a kiosk, but it's an ATM kiosk. And for whatever reason, this property performs at the higher end of the cap rates. And I would never suggest that we take one cap rate and say that's what we should use. because there are so many factors involved in capitalization rates. But the point is, what I was told by the owner about the risk that's involved in this type of property compared to a typical strip seems to be corroborated by our own evidence. And for that reason, I'm asking the board to take a look at a few factors here. One is, we all agreed last cycle that the capitalization rate on this property should be 7.75%, for whatever that's worth. Two, the broker studies, the assessor, and Altus all agree that overall compression is basically zero between the two cycles. I actually have that summarized on page 3 of this study, is a summary of the broker reports from last cycle and this cycle. And whatever their numbers, exact numbers may be, because they have different ways of calculating, they may have closing costs involved, etc. We never actually say bang to that number. But what's interesting is the trajectory that they're suggesting, or lack of. Static. When we back up and we think about what's happening in retail and office, there are reasons for that. And the next thing that this study talks about is something that I've talked, I think, to everybody on the panel about, and that is what's happening to the cost of money as of April 18. Because the cost of money is one of the main driving factors in the capitalization rate. An investor is looking at what it's going to cost to buy the building. A large amount of that is debt. What is the cost of the money they need to borrow? They have to make sure the return outpaces that, with a premium for real estate risks, with a premium for this and that. That's where the cap rate comes from. So if the fundamental starting point in the capitalization rate is the cost of money, and the cost of money as of 2017 suddenly shoots up because the Bank of Canada overnight rate goes up, which then influences the mortgage rates and eventually cap rates. If you're an investor and you said 2 years ago 7.75% was appropriate then, cost of money is increasing, do you think you would compress your rate of return? I would suggest not. So it all fits together. We have an asset which I think everybody agrees would perform at a higher risk applied to it. We have an opinion of where that risk should end up for the resulting capitalization rate in the past. We have evidence that nothing's changed. We have reasons why nothing has changed. And I suggest to you nothing should change. The cap rate should remain 7.75%. I'll stop on going through the study again, unless, Mr. Chairman, is there anything more that you wish for me to go through? I think we've gone through this a lot.
Well, I can't guide your presentation.
So I'll pause there. That concludes why we believe 7.75% in this case should be used.
Okay, any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I have one question.
Okay.
Okay, you mentioned in your presentation nothing has changed, and then cap rate should be remain in this last year cap rate of 7.75. Did you know we changed our vacancy rate in last year to this year?
Yeah, for the
Medical
yes.
office building? Yes, because medical office building last year, we cannot compare assessment, but I will give this one as a education piece. Our valuation last year is lower because we have to use we have to give the 10% of extra vacancy on the medical office building. It was vacant many years. We given that extra vacancy. Valuation was lower last cycle, but now it's no vacancy. It's reported. We inspect property that someone, and it's for the business assessment purposes. It's all licensed.
Right.
I think 1 or 2 units still vacant, but within the parameters of 4%. That's the main reason, just for education piece only.
Yeah.
But it was changed.
The vacancy.
From vacancy.
And thank you for that. And that actually was part of the conversation I had with the owner, because the increase in this property is significant. But we mentioned that the assessor was good about recognizing the vacancy incurred at the time and had a higher vacancy allowance, which of course they've now cured through the work that they've been doing. But that doesn't necessarily answer the part that I'm talking about, which is the risk that an investor would apply in their analysis of the return on that income. So, but what I'm saying is, the difference in the property has already been recognized by the lower vacancy allowance. It was higher last time to recognize the vacancy. We've lowered that. We've accounted for that. I don't think we should double account for it by a lower cap rate. That's all.
Okay,
Thank you,
any-
Mr. Chairman.
Fran, questions?
No questions.
Carrie?
No questions, thank you.
I have just one question. It's probably more for curiosity than anything. The mall on McPhillips, I'm quite familiar with it since
Yeah.
I live near there,
Okay.
was bought and then extensively renovated. Would that make a difference to the apparently high cap rate on it?
Yeah, it would. And I don't know the ins and outs of the actual deal, but this is exactly why it's difficult to take one cap rate and say, aha, looks the same as ours, so we should have the same cap rate. There's all sorts of factors that happen involved in each sale. So what I imagine happened there is that the property, perhaps they were recognizing a greater potential, but it needed a lot of work to get there. So they paid less for the property because they know they have to spend money. You see it a lot, Mr. McIntyre would know this well, in apartments. Somebody can pay low amount, but it looks like a low cap rate because they're recognizing, I'm gonna put in X amount of dollars, I'll get around, rent controls, I'll be able to get a higher income, and in the end of the day, it all makes sense to them. So it's a very good question, Mr. Chairman, and I can't answer exactly the ins and outs of the sale, but again, I'm not suggesting we should use 9.3%.
Yeah, and I lied, I got a second question. These sort of shopping centers, like the two we've been talking about, that have an office component, would the owner benefit from having a varied income stream in terms of if there's a downturn in retail, you still got the office component to provide income, or vice versa? Does that help the property?
I think that's an excellent question. I don't know how to answer that, but I would say, makes sense. Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Okay, those are my questions. I don't know if anything arises from that.
Thank you.
That concludes today's hearing then.
Okay.
So thank you very much for your presentations.
Thank you.